Well,
Well, very good. Charles, it's good to have you with us. In case you haven't met him, this is Charles Stone, and we're talking today because he has a new book out. It's called People Pleasing Pastors. But before we get to the book, Charles, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
yeah, you bet, Tony. I've been a minister over 30 years. This is my third book. I'm currently lead pastor at a church in London, Ontario, 2 hours from Detroit, like 3 months. So brand new to Canadian life, but really enjoying it.
Well, very good. And so I'm really curious about the book. Before we get to some specifics, what drove you to write it?
Well, Tony, I consider myself a recovering people pleaser. I probably early on in my ministry, because pastors want to please people and that we want them to stay at our churches, we want them to be happy. I began to develop some of these subtle habits and patterns in me that I didn't realize. As I began to get a little more wiser and found like I had a pretty high misery level when I would say yes to things that I shouldn't say yes to, and it would come back on me and it would create more problems. I began to realize that I had some of these traits in me. And there wasn't a lot written out there, a few blogs here and there. And so just really felt prompted to dig deeper into this, did some research, and the end result is the book came out.
Well, that's great. And actually, it was, I think, as you were doing some research that I learned about your project. So, can you talk a little bit about what you uncovered in that research and what you learned about the extent of people pleasing in ministry?
Yeah. The research took two directions. One was Lifeway Research surveyed about 1,000 pastors for me, and I had another pool of like 1,200 pastors. We did online research. We asked them questions related to people pleasing, and the second one also dug a little deeper. And what we found out was really pretty surprising to me, Tony. The Lifeway research revealed 79% of pastors self-admitted to people pleasing at some level. The online research, which is a little more honest, you don't have to answer anybody live, you're a little more honest, 91% admitted to it at some level. So it's quite pervasive. And I don't know what those other 10 to 15%, if they really have it all together, or maybe they just weren't willing to say, yeah, sometimes it's a struggle for me.
Yeah. Well, to me, to be truthful, I'm not surprised for two reasons. Number one, I get to work with pastors in churches
Yeah,
across the
yeah,
country. And I just know how they're wired up. But
yeah,
secondly, I think it's just part of what attracts people to the ministry is this desire to help people, right? And I
yeah.
think that just that natural value for wanting to help others, it kind of draws people that may have a tendency toward people pleasing. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I think it's important probably to note that there's good people pleasing. You know, we're called to serve Christ and love people and express the fruit of the Spirit, and that pleases people. But you're right, the very nature of what we do can lead us down the road of healthy people.
So, in your book, you kind of base everything you write about on the three B's: Bible, Bowen, and the brain. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, in Ecclesiastes, it talks about the three corded strands. So what I built the book on were three basic threads. Fundamentally is Scripture, because I'm a Bible believing, I'm a theologian, so I'm committed to Scripture. The second one is the brain. I'm halfway through a master's program on the neuroscience of leadership. My daughter was diagnosed at age 1 brain tumor. She's now 26. I've lived in this neuroscience world, so I have a very much a passion on how the brain affects leadership. In fact, I have another book coming out next year on that very thing. The third one is a new kind of body of insight from a guy named Murray Bowen. He was a psychiatrist in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and he worked for the National Institutes of Health, and he worked with schizophrenics, and he found out when he worked with them one-on-one, it didn't really help them, but when he worked with them in a system with their family or other closely connected people, he found out he was able to make progress. So we developed some concepts around that have great applicability to leadership. And fundamentally, it's how we handle our emotions, our emotionality. When we see it from a systemic viewpoint as a system, we're able to unpack it more carefully. And there's a lot of real clear biblical parallels in what he discovered. So that's the three B's: the Bible.
Well, very good. And let's help. Obviously, one of the practical takeaways from today's conversation is I want people to pick up your book, Charles. But talk specifically to pastors and other ministry leaders. What are some practical next steps they can take related to this topic?
Well, one of the, I think, fundamental realizations is why we do it is we don't like those uncomfortable feelings of anxiety when someone gives us maybe slight rejection or heavy rejection. It's uncomfortable. So what kind of drives us to get involved in unhealthy people pleasing is we want to make that anxiety go away. And that's one of the things Murray Bowen really was able to capture. So I think we as pastors is recognizing that's kind of the way we're wired. Even our brains are wired that way. There's something called the amygdala. It's just kind of our fight flight part of our brain. And it rises up when we're across the board table in a boardroom, we feel threatened by or just like if we were out in the, hiking and a bear came after us. Feels the same exact way, same kind of biological things going on. So simply understanding that God wired us that way, and by being aware of that, that's really a huge step. Now, also in the book, I have a list of like 7 specific steps that I think pastors can apply to help us all deal with that.
That's great. I'm curious, as a pastor then and dealing with this issue, do you think there's something for the church as a whole to learn from this? And how can churches maybe give some coaching and some teaching to the church on this topic?
Well, you're exactly right. And I think I operate by the assumption that most people in the church are good-natured. There's a few of them that are going to cause problems and create havoc for a pastor. And so those aside, whatever reasons why they act like that, I think it is really, really helpful for pastors to, in their teaching, understand how we're made up, how God wired us. And people pleasing is something that we all tend to do. And by understanding how God wired us, I think in the church, we can be more grace-filled in what we expect pastors to be, instead of like expecting the pastor to be at every single activity. That's kind of a, standard thing. People need to realize that, I need to moderate my expectations and realize that if this pastor meets all of my needs that I want, then he's not going to be that effective leader that God called him to be really for that whole body or that whole ministry. So it goes across the board. It's not just pastors alone. It's church people as well.
That's great. Well, Charles, in addition to picking up your book, it's called People-Pleasing Pastors, Avoiding the Pitfalls of Approval-Motivated Leadership. So in addition to picking up the book, if folks want to follow kind of your journey and your writing, are there other places that they can go?
Yeah, Tony, I blog a couple of times a week on some of these kind of subjects. It's charlesstone.com. 2 S's in the middle, charlesstone.com. I'd love to dialogue. I have an email list that somebody can follow me in, so the blogs will be sent straight to them. So that'd be the best place to connect with me.
Very good. Well, Charles, thanks again for joining us today. It's an important topic for all of us to engage, especially when we're in leadership in the church. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Tony.